I do not condone nor encourage any form of harassment towards both the channel and the historian I'm responding to, regardless of the massive disagreements I will display on this video, and my personal resentment towards their modus operandi. Hey! Oh my gosh. Holy Mother Russia! Hey noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking. I need a drink. Do you remember when the other day I made a react video to History Hits Egyptologist? And he wasn't that great, so then I made a react video to Wired Egyptologist, and she was actually really good. And then I did say that when it comes to History Hit, it really is a matter of hit or miss, if you will, and sometimes the experts are really good, and other times, yeah, hit or miss. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to Miss Alexandra, how the heck do you read her name? Pomieko. Never a title. Was more appropriate. Historian answers Google's most popular questions about the Soviet Union. Woohoo! Get ready, let's go. Come on.
Hi, my name is Alexandra Pomieczko. I am a lecturer in modern history at King's College London, and I am here with History Hit to answer the most Googled questions about the Soviet Union.
Please. Oh.
So the first question is...
Hold on a minute. I see what you did, History Hit. I see it. Now there is something that I need to tell you about this video that I really think you need to know before we begin the actual reaction. If you check the comments, you'll notice that there is something fishy. Some comments are extremely negative. History Hit is garbage for putting this out there. This video is disgusting, notice 2 days ago. But 1 day ago, overall a very interesting and informative video. I mean, that is a big difference of opinion, isn't it? 2 days ago, propaganda hit. 1 day ago, some of the comments are delusional. 1 day ago, this woman is good. And yet, 2 days ago, LOL, she seems incredibly biased. Look at the difference. What was going on? Well, let me tell you. What's happening, ladies and gentlemen, is that the video now is 29 minutes and 34 seconds long. But when I watched the video 2 days ago, the video was over 30 minutes long. 31, 32, something like this. They cut it out. They cut out the section that a lot of people are talking about when they say the video was really bad. Yes, it was edited by History Hit out directly on YouTube. You can do that. What section was it? It's actually quite easy to answer that question. Look at the thumbnail. The one thing they probably forgot to update or change is the thumbnail, because if you look at the thumbnail, you can still see Soviet Union. Was the Soviet Union evil? Why did the Soviet Union hate the US? How many died in the gulags? Now, let's double check that with the timestamps. Why did the Soviet Union hate the US? Check. How many people died in the gulags? Check. But the question whether or not they were evil is not here. So what? She didn't answer that one? Oh no, she did. And I watched it. And it was bad. As a further proof of that, if you look at the description, this is the current description. Who founded the Soviet Union? Was it communist? How did it defeat? Blah, blah, blah. And then the name of the historian. Here's the thing though. When you manipulate or change the video description on YouTube, it updates immediately. But on Facebook and Google, it doesn't. So we can still have a glimpse at what it looked like before. And we can still see the description. And it is, who founded the Soviet Union? Was it evil? Yeah, they replaced was it evil with was it communist? This is why people were so upset. So what did she say? Well, luckily, we can see exactly what she said in the comments, because people, of course, quoted her and then responded. Although then again, I have to admit that the number of comments has been going mysteriously down. I mean, look, right this second at 4:01 p.m. there are 416 comments on this 20,000 views video, and yet I took a screenshot at 3:39 and it had 421, and before that it had 426. So comments keep disappearing. So before these disappear, let me read them to you, noble ones. At this point, I'm waiting for an expert to tell us Genghis Khan wasn't evil because he allowed religious freedom. So as you can see, evil is mentioned. And here we see one of the two things that she said in that section that caused so much backlash they had to cut it out. It wasn't more evil than any other country. That is exactly what she said as one of the things. So she's reading the question, was the Soviet Union evil? And she says it wasn't more evil than any other country. And then the next question is about the gulags and the millions of people that were. So yeah, it's getting people really upset. The second thing she said is this: the Soviet Union wasn't more evil than the US. She absolutely stated this. So she is literally comparing a totalitarian regime under Stalin specifically. Stalin. And she's saying, well, it's not more evil than the West and the US. Now, what's really insane about this statement is the fact that it's coming from a historian. If you ask me as a person, then I would tell you that all totalitarian regimes were evil. Austrian painter was evil, Mussolini was evil, Stalin was objectively evil. Just look at the millions of casualties. With that being said, I would also tell the audience or the person asking me that if I have to respond as a historian, evil and good are usually not used in academia as a way to describe both historical events and forms of government and totalitarian regimes and historical people, simply because emotions come into play when you do that and you want to try and kind of stick to the cold facts. But then again, if you ask me naturally, yes, okay, but do you think it was, yeah, he was evil. Absolutely. The fact that she would try and deflect that to the point of saying, well, so was everyone else. No. Then if you want to be objective about the fact, not everyone else did what they did in communist Russia, for instance, with the gulags, which you talk about a second after. That was a total catastrophe of a section. So they removed it. And what I discovered is that this is not the first time that something like this happens with Dr. Alexandra Pomiechko, because there is one more video on YouTube with her. It's very long, it's an hour long. And it's called Dr. Alexandra Pomiechko, Bandits and Outlaws in the Polish-Soviet Borderlands 1918-1925. And it's on the channel Center for Ukrainian-Canadian Studies. The comments have been turned off completely. Now that you have the full context, you know why I'm a little harsher than you would imagine when I comment this. Let's jump right into it. Okay, so I see she's already got a little flag with the hammer and sickle. That's very appropriate. Stalin would be proud.
The next question, was the Soviet Union communist? This is actually more of a complicated answer than people would think. Ideologues in the Soviet Union would not consider themselves or not consider the state to be communist. Attaining communism was a continual process in the minds of Soviet ideologues. They saw Russia as having began its foundation as a feudal state, then kind of moved up to capitalism, albeit very briefly. Then during its existence, the Soviet Union was imagined as being in a socialist state, right? That's how you have Soviet socialist republics. You don't have, Soviet communist republics. There were a lot of discussions amongst members of the Central Committee about how to continually evolve into this ideal communist state. So from that perspective, you could argue that the Soviet Union was never communist throughout its entire existence. It was constantly building up to that point. That's not to say...
Okay, did you finish? Because I don't want to interrupt.
This is...
Okay, so this is a very easy answer. Yes, they were communists. So that's what we are doing, is it? All right, so let me comment on this. I would like to premise, before I say anything, interject, apart from the jokes, before I present my ideas, I do want to underline the fact that I am no expert on this field. This is a little bit outside my field of expertise. And also, unfortunately, I don't have a team member with my researchers and academics that is specialized in this area. Therefore, my words cannot be peer-reviewed for this video, which basically means do take whatever I say with a pinch of salt. I'm telling you that for intellectual honesty, although then again, even when it comes to people who are specialists on any field, still double check whatever they say and use your own critical thinking. With that being said, what this appears to me is something that academics tend to do when they have an agenda. I still don't know if she has an agenda, I'm just saying what it appears to be. Because it's what is called a manipulation. Really using semantics. She's saying, well, they had this idea of communism as it would have functioned or should function, and because they didn't actually attain that exactly, then we can't really say that they were 100% communists. No, they were communists. communists. Because if that were the case, then we could apply the same concept to the fascists. Benito Mussolini's idea of basing his fascist state and regime upon the recreation of the ancient Roman Empire was never attained how he wanted. It didn't even get close. Can we then use the same and apply the same logic to say, well, then were they really fascist? Not exactly. You could do the same with the Third Reich. Were they really? I mean, it's just semantics. They were communists by any stretch of definition. Of course they were communists. And just because they didn't attain the most utopic version of communism, which, in my opinion, in its complete theoretical frame is unattainable anyways, doesn't mean that they weren't communist in the way we mean that word. Massive disagreement with the doctor, professor, archbishop here.
That's not to say that people didn't refer to the Soviet Union as communists. In particular, in the West, referring to the Soviet Union as communist was done in a very sort of derogatory way.
So now she's blaming it to Western propaganda. Oh, that's why we call them communists, because the West was using it in a derogatory way. No, that sounds like your own propaganda, professor, so I object. And I object very much. Stalin was a communist. Lenin was a communist.
To create a stark difference between, quote-unquote, the capitalist, kind of more open-minded, market-driven Western states versus the more backward, quote-unquote, communist state that was the Soviet Union. So the next question is, was the Soviet Union a democracy?
No.
The Soviet Union, for the majority of its existence, operated as a one-party state.
Yep.
So in that sense, no. But sometimes people think of the Soviet Union as functioning as a democracy because of this idea of democratic centralism that was really at the heart of the Communist Party.
Oh, that's insane. Is she trying to... A one-party state cannot be democratic by definition. It doesn't matter what sort of mental gymnastics you're going to try and use or definitional loopholes. If you have a one-party state, it means people cannot vote anything but the party that is the only one available. So no. A totalitarian regime with maximum autocracy isn't democratic. You don't need 15 PhDs to say that.
It still held elections. It still held local elections. It still held regional elections. And this democratic centralism really referred to members sort of at the upper echelons of the party having an equal say. Sometimes these were kind of premeditated negotiations before, but there was definitely a semblance, at least a portrayal of the Soviet Union functioning in this kind of democratic sense.
That's called propaganda, professor.
There was a process and a responsibility to vote in your local elections, to vote in your regional elections. It didn't really refer to everyone in the state having an equal say, but that's kind of how, definitions or understandings of democracy may fit within the context of the Soviet Union.
They do not fit in the context of the Soviet Union under the totalitarian regime. That's absolute nonsense, professor. This is a mess, in my humble opinion. Do let me know if you disagree. Since this isn't USSR and Soviet Union, and you can disagree without ending in a gulag. A little specification, professor.
How many people died in the gulags?
Oh, that's a big one. Let's see what she's going to say.
It's difficult to assess precise figures because records were not meticulously kept. By some
surprise me.
historians' accounts, about 1.5 million died in the Gulag system. The same sort of historians have suggested that around 18 million people passed through the Gulag camps. So that gives you a bit of a maybe proportional kind of perspective to see, in proportion to how many people passed through the camps, how many people perished.
My gosh. Of course, I can't verify, because once again, this is not my area of expertise. I'm just going to work with her numbers, which are already monstrous. 80 million people were sent to the gulags in oftentimes harsh conditions, imprisoned and forced to do labor for the state against their will, and 1.5 million, possibly more, for what I remember reading, but then again, died. That is terrible. That's why you will never see a little red flag with a sickle and hammer on my desk. Just like you will never see the swastika, never.
How bad were the conditions in the gulags? The reason we knew about the conditions of the gulags prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote this book in the late 60s and early 70s called The Gulag Archipelago. He wrote a book called A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, discussing everyday life for the ordinary prisoner, talking about conditions. Yes, they were bad everywhere, but it depended also where one would be located. If you were located somewhere in the far north, you had to worry about how to stay warm in the winter.
Yeah.
This was not an issue, for example, with someone on the southern part of the Soviet Union. Different prisoners fell in different sort of hierarchies and ranks within the Gulag system. Intellectual prisoners who committed crimes, allegedly or real, were seen as sort of the more delicate prisoners, the ones who would likely not survive the harsh conditions of labor.
At least I appreciate that she said alleged, real or not real. I appreciate that point.
So if you were, let's say, a more notorious prisoner, the murderers, the rapists, you had access to better food because you could barter or you could procure things from outside of the camp itself.
Really?
If you were a guard in the Gulag, you weren't entirely happy to be posted somewhere in the middle of nowhere in Siberia or in the far north. So what you see is oftentimes prisoners and guards having a much more intimate relationship with each other, exchanging goods. So it was certainly very difficult, but these gulags really operated as entire worlds and societies in themselves.
Yeah, it sounds horrible. I don't think there is anything wrong. It seems like she has a problem saying that. It's horrible.
People died under Stalin.
Boom.
Again, the question of figures is very difficult to establish because of inefficient record keeping, because of the intentional destruction of records and documents that would point to figures,
Yeah.
and because of sort of chaos under which Stalin ruled. So there was a war also going on. One of the most important reasons why scholars don't have figures about how many people died under Stalin is because there's a lot of debate about when this repression happened and how early we should start counting and establishing these figures, and also how late we should go. So do we start when Stalin comes into power in the late 1920s, and should we end in 1938, or do we go into all the way 1941?
Personally, I would say the entire thing. From the split second when he had power to the very last moment before he died, that's when I would count. Because why does it matter? I don't understand why there would be any other way. The moment anything in his hand, even if he committed murders and had people eliminated before he had power, that should be counted. Because when people are asking, that's what I mean when I say semantics and technicalities. Academics use that a lot to skew the data. Yeah, if people ask how many people died under Stalin, they want to know how many people, how many human beings lost their lives because of this monster. That's the question. What's the point in asking, yeah, but until 38 or until 41? Should I count when he had the people this good? Because that wasn't exactly him. He told someone else to do it, so does it really count? I mean, this I added. She didn't say that. Not doing a straw man, but still.
So you certainly have what is called the Terror in the 1930s, or the Great Purges in the 1930s. And the Great Terror, the height of the purges, occurred between 1936 and 1938. So the types of people that we see targeted are, of course, members of the Communist Party, who are now seen as sort of enemies of the state. People with German-sounding names, Jews, Poles, Koreans as well, different nationality groups being targeted, who are also executed and shot.
Oh yes, Stalin was very racist, by the way, if you really look at it for the way it is. Because usually when we think of racial hierarchy, we think of the Germans and the Austrian painter, who clearly was a massive racist. But so was Stalin. He was also racist, and he also targeted and shot people, as she's saying, because of their political affiliations, because they didn't like him, because of their ethnicity.
Mass deportations of people deported somewhere in the middle of nowhere, in Kazakhstan or in the Far East or in Siberia. This is another way in which people perished during the Stalin years.
Yep.
The next question is, why did the Soviet Union hate the United States? There wasn't so much hate as there was maybe perhaps more fascination.
On what planet? Seriously? Oh gosh. Oh yeah, the USSR, Stalin, they all loved the US. They were like, wow, I really wish I could get a nice steak and sweet tea. Sweet tea. Love the US.
People were curious to know what life was like in the West, not only in the United States. The evil, the hate, and these kinds of words come out of Cold War discourse that was very sort of polarizing and intended to be polarizing. But in reality, if you look at accounts from the Soviet Union, especially in the 60s and 70s, we know that there was a lot of interest in material culture and culture coming from the West. They were curious in reading what was being published in the West. They were interested in hearing music that was being played in the West.
I'm curious to understand what she means by they, and I think they needs to be specifically underlined, Professor, before you continue with your presentation and discuss the information, because I think that makes it confusing now. Who's they? The general population? The authorities? The politicians? Who are you talking about? The army? Members of KGB? Like, who are you talking about? Because normally when people ask, why did Russia or why did the USSR hate the US? If you talk about the politicians, yeah, they did. But when you talk about the everyday Russian, they don't represent. I mean, the politicians, even though that's the way we see it, they don't really represent them, particularly considering the fact that the Bolshevik came to power by force. So that's another thing. Will there be some Russians? I mean, also Russia's massive. So obviously there will be people that don't care. Maybe the young, they don't particularly care about that, and then instead they like it. Oh, nice, American music, of course. But the professor has to underline that, because now she's making it sound Russia, USSR, everyone, oh, they loved the West. And we know that's not true. That is not true.
There was a big hippie movement in the Soviet Union that was largely inspired by youth movements of the late 1960s and the early 1970s. There was less hatred and more curiosity and actually connections between these different sort of cultures and people, especially at the kind of societal level. Was the Soviet Union poor? Again, it depends on what we mean by poor. Certainly, a lot of images circulated in the West with people waiting in lines to get food with ration cards. So in the West, there was this image that people in the Soviet Union were poor. But in reality, it was not necessarily the case. One could argue that the Soviet Union offered employment officially to every person residing in the Soviet Union. One could argue that perhaps being less
offered employment to every single person sounds impossible. Again, not the expert.
Materialistic, as the West was often portrayed to be and often was. But in terms of people having access to food, people having access to what they needed, it's pretty much dependent on the time period we're talking about. If we're talking about the Second World War, then of course people, living under the siege of Leningrad would not have had access to food.
Yeah, that sounds such an apologetic cop-out. It's insane. Oh no, the West, bad West propagandists were saying that the Soviet Union and people living under the Soviet Union were poor, but the reality is, oh no, they offered jobs to every single person and people had access to food, and the ones that didn't was because of the siege of Leningrad. So it wasn't because the system was a complete utter mess, historically. Yeah, don't like her, not one bit.
How was life in the Soviet Union compared to the West? I think some of the most interesting accounts that we have speaking to this question come from people, for example, who escaped or emigrated outside of the Soviet Union and lived in the West, who were critical of both the Soviet Union and the West, as well as many people who were from the West originally and emigrated to the Soviet Union. They were very happy in the Soviet Union. In general, if you were living in the Soviet Union, your access to higher education and to opportunities was better than that in the West. Your access and ability to get a job was higher in the Soviet Union versus in the West.
Source, please.
On the other hand, if you wanted to protest or do things like that, then life in the West would have allowed for that much more smoothly than if you were living in the Soviet Union.
You know why? Because the Soviet Union was not democratic. How about that, Professor? How about that?
Were people happy in the Soviet Union? People were mixed in their emotions. After the Soviet Union collapsed, people seemed to have mixed feelings about the system. Some people really hated it and had very negative things to say about it. Some people, in a very sort of nostalgic way, recall the Soviet Union in a positive way. They talk about this lack of issues amongst ethno-national groups. They talk about a life that was very simple. If you were in the Gulag, you probably weren't very happy. But if you were in the communist...
If you were in a Gulag, you probably weren't very happy. Just say it, Professor. If you were in a Gulag, you were miserable. Just say it. Say the truth. No euphemisms.
Party, and you had kind of access to different goods and benefits, you probably were happier relatively. When did the Soviet Union start and end?
When did it start and end?
So the beginnings of the Soviet state come through the numerous revolutions from 1905, then February 1917, then October 1917 when the Bolsheviks come to power. But that doesn't necessarily mark the beginning of the Soviet Union. Chronologically, that's very easy. The Soviet Union was created on the 30th of December, 1922. There was quite a lot of conflict, the Russian Civil War, the various border wars that occurred, which delayed the official founding of the Soviet state. Initially, it was these four founding republics, the Russian one, the Ukrainian, Belarusian, and one called the Transcaucasian. And it ceased to exist on the 25th of December, 1991. Why is Soviet architecture so depressing? That's the next question. I think it's based on your taste, right? For some people it was depressing, for other people it was beautiful. You know,
Sure.
all these beautiful sort of icons in some of the former cities of the Soviet state that people visit to this day. The other thing is, you know, the wide avenues. Those are all kind of reflective of Soviet architecture, which I think has sort of a unique flavor in itself. Moving on, our next question is, who founded the Soviet Union? Like with any foundation of any state, it's usually not down to one particular person. So of course Lenin was instrumental in the founding of the state, in its sort of political roots and ideological orientation, but there were other many important political figures also involved. You have Trotsky, who became war commissar, very important to Union Army to kind of create the state. You have also the creating of Soviet security forces, and this was done by a man called Felix Dzerzhinsky. You have a lot of women being involved in sort of the social aspects of the foundation of the Soviet Union. Lenin's wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, she was very instrumental and kind of his right-hand person when it came to the organizational, logistical aspects of the creation and foundation of the Soviet Union. And you have other people like Alexandra Kollontai, who was also kind of at the forefront of getting a lot of women involved in the founding. So really, it's not just Lenin, it's a lot of factors and many different types of individuals who founded the Soviet Union.
Is it me? Do call me out if I'm strawmanning her at this point. But is it me? Now she really sounds like her objective is to make the USSR sound as good as possible from a modern perspective. No, they didn't hate the Americans and America and the West. They were fascinated. There was a lot of connection. And it was the West that said that they were communists. They weren't really communists. And the women had so much power and freedom. It sounds like a complete cover-up. It's an obfuscation through semantics.
The next question is, why did the Soviets have gulags? One of the reasons why the Soviet Union had gulags was, of course, to banish people places, right? To send them outside of the cities and to send them to these very remote areas where they would not be, troublesome. The other reason why
Oh, that's insane. My gosh, today we've got full-on USSR apologetics on display, ladies and gentlemen. So let me get this straight. The Gulag exists, the Gulag exists to banish people so they wouldn't be troublesome. Is like saying German concentration camps existed so that the Jews wouldn't cause trouble in the towns and the cities. That's why, oh my goodness gracious, what am I watching? History hit.
The Soviet Union had gulags was to also use these prisoners to extract coal, for example, from the far north. Lumber.
Yeah, that's slave labor.
Was a big industry, oil extraction, things like that. So it functioned both as a system of punishment and prison, if you will, but also served to fuel the economy by using essentially free force labor.
Yeah, free force labor, or aka slavery. And I would like to underline one thing. Once again, she's selecting and choosing her words very methodically, but I can see right through it. Prison and punishment makes it sound the people that ended up there deserved it. You gotta give me that, because it does really sound like it. I'm not 100% sure, which is why I'm not building a strawman. I want to see how she continues, but up to this point, oh, they weren't communists, it was the West propaganda. Oh, gulags, where they were sent there because so that people wouldn't cause trouble. And then she talks about prison and punishment. She makes it sound these are criminals. These are not criminals. A lot of the people that are sent to the gulags by the Soviet state are just people that are considered to be a threat to their totalitarian regime. In other words, free thinkers. people that didn't agree, people that in his particularly most maniac years of Stalin, and this is history, there is a specific time in Stalin's regime that he would think everyone was out to get him. And up to a certain point I can understand it, but literally he would, the moment he would think, and I don't know, I don't like the way this guy looked at me, or I heard this rumor, out in the Gulag you go. So yeah. It's systematic elimination of possible political dissidents and people with different ideas. That's what a Gulag is. Let's make it clear.
The Gulag was this huge network of prisoner camps, labor camps, penal camps, things like that. And they were spread all over the Soviet Union, oftentimes in very harsh places. Already in the 16th century, you have this katorga system of forced imprisonment and forced labor. And so many of the places where the Soviet Union then picked up using these penal colonies and penal camps were already pre-existing. Some of you will know that the famous writer Fyodor Dostoevsky himself spent time in such a penal colony during late Imperial Russia. How was the Soviet Union created? So this kind of ties in back to the people and the origin story. So one could say that the Soviet Union was created officially, legally at the end of 1922. But just because one creates a state or announces the establishment of the state, that does not necessarily mean that your state runs perfectly and smoothly and centrally. One answer is politically the Soviet Union was created. Chaotically, one could say the Soviet Union was created. In turmoil, it was created.
Yep.
It took many, many years for the Soviet state to stabilize. It's a massive amount of space with a very diverse group of people.
Oh yeah, and Stalin had a very interesting idea on how to take care of the diverse group of people within the state, right? As she mentioned, you have the wrong surname, Gulag. You're a Jew, Gulag. You're this, Gulag. You're that, Gulag. Yeah, I imagine it took several years to organize all that diversity.
It took many years to fight against anti-revolutionary forces. It took many years to convince locals to be part of this new state. It was created through propaganda. It was created by Bolshevik ideologues going into the countryside and different parts of the empire, trying to convince individuals that it was worth being part of the Soviet project. So a lot of kind of grassroots activity as well, not just things happening from Moscow and St. Petersburg, but also individuals trying to really convince peoples of the former Soviet empire to participate in this Soviet experiment and into this Soviet project. So the next question is, what countries were in the Soviet Union?
Wow.
I heard someone call the structure of the Soviet Union a Hershey chocolate bar because you have all these different pieces together, but they're tied at the same time, which also kind of speaks to how it was so easily able to break up, at least initially, because you have kind of these defined borders already created very early on. I think when people think of countries, they're referring to the 15 Soviet socialist republics that were part of the Soviet Union. So of course the founding ones, the Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. Then you have the Transcaucasian one that broke down and became the Georgian, Armenian, and Azerbaijani Soviet Socialist Republic. Then you have the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, who were also Soviet Socialist Republics. You have what's now Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan that were former Soviet Socialist Republics. And last but not least, Moldova. That was also a Soviet Socialist Republic. Was everyone in the Soviet Union Russian? So by the fall of the Soviet Union, the population of ethnic Russians in the Soviet Union was about 50.8%. The dominant population, what are known as Eastern Slavs, so Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians, they composed about 70% of the population, give or take, throughout the existence of the Soviet Union. We also have a very large Muslim population. There are also different populations that were at once very prominent in the Soviet Union, the ethnic German population that used to live around the Volga River region, also in southern Ukraine. You also have a once very vibrant Jewish community living in the western parts of the Soviet state that, because of the Second World War, the majority of which did not survive. You also have a very vibrant Crimean Tatar population that was very active, that also gets displaced in 1944. You also have very interesting indigenous communities in the Far East and in Siberia. You have a very significant Buddhist population living around Lake Baikal. The Russian population composed a very small majority. There were over 100 different ethno-national groups in existence in the Soviet Union. Was the Soviet Union an empire? This is a question that historians debate a lot,
Yeah,
because
sure.
it depends on your understanding of empire.
Absolutely. Empire is a definitional cesspool, but I want to see how she tackles it.
If one understands an empire as a political entity that extracts materials or resources, human resources as well, for the benefit of the center, then yes, the Soviet Union functioned as an empire. Some people would challenge this and say, well, you have a bit of decentralization because you have all of these different Soviet socialist republics that had kind of their own system of operation. And this is true to an extent, but ultimately these different republics were subservient to what was happening in Moscow. So while there was a bit of a decentralized system that would challenge kind of the more classical understanding of an empire, I would say that it certainly did function and operate as an empire.
I think that's a good answer. At the end of the day, we do call the Holy Roman Empire an empire, even though technically it isn't exactly an empire. I could expand on a dedicated video, but you gotta let me know in the comments. And then, once again, technically wasn't Roman, and was it holy? It's a little debatable too. Of course, I'm basing this on a very famous statement that is partially true, but it needs to be discussed. So I might do that.
Nazis have an alliance. They did not have an alliance
No.
per se, but they had a non-aggressive
Yeah.
pact, or
At
a pact
first.
of non-aggression rather, also referred to as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after the foreign ministers of the Soviet Union and of Germany that were negotiating this pact together. There was an official open part of the pact. Both states agreed not to attack each other, and they also agreed not to support any third party attacking that particular state. And it was going to be up for renewal after 10 years. The second part of the pact, the secret aspect, was the one that ultimately divided Europe, Eastern Europe specifically, into sort of this sphere of influence, giving the Soviet Union control over the Baltic region and parts of Bessarabia, and splitting Poland into two.
Poland,
And
yeah.
this later part
My
of the
gosh.
pact came into effect essentially when Nazi Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, and when the Soviet Union subsequently also invaded Poland from the east on September 17th in 1939. The next question is, how did the Soviet Union defeat Germany? Historians actually used to say this a lot. There's something about the harshness and resilience of the Russian that made them sort of survive and outlast the siege of Leningrad, the Battle of Stalingrad, and sort of the everyday struggle of life. This is incorrect because there weren't just Russians serving in the Red Army.
Right.
And for that matter, there weren't even just Russian men serving in the Red Army. There were women also serving in the Red Army. The other sort of interesting reason I've heard, and this has been debunked, it's one that people used to actually say when I was in school. The Germans weren't used to a very harsh winter.
I remember that
they would have experienced on the Eastern Front.
I remember
And this is
that.
also not entirely true. The winter of 41, 42, and 43 weren't necessarily colder than previous years. And to add to that, the Germans had already been occupying Eastern Europe prior to the invasion of the Soviet Union. So what did contribute to Soviet victory? A part of it had to do with the fact that the Germans were never able to secure critical places. They were never able to capture Moscow. They were never able to capture Leningrad. They were never able to capture the very strategic oil fields they needed.
I mean, all of this, sure, but I also think that the reason why the Soviets at the end of the day were not defeated by the Germans is because the Germans were fighting a multi-front war. They were fighting against the US, they were fighting against the UK, they were fighting against France. Their other ally was on the other side of the planet. So at the end of the day, if the Germans only fought the Russians, could they have won? Maybe there could be an interesting discussion for a speculative historical analysis of what may have been. But I think those factors play a pivotal role in the fact that when you're fighting on multiple fronts, you have to balance your resource allocations and unit deployment. And it is what it is. I mean.
And Germany really needed energy and oil and petroleum to kind of fund its activity. Aside from Germany being unable to access these strategic areas, Belarus served as one of the biggest arenas for partisan activity. So the next question is, why did the Soviet Union want to join NATO? This is always a bit surprising to some people. NATO was created in 1949, and in 1954, the question of Germany becomes a lot more critical. So Germany is still demilitarized and occupied at this point. And there were conversations amongst NATO that perhaps Germany should join NATO, which means that it would be militarized. And the Soviet Union had a very big issue with militarizing, and they were afraid that if any part of Germany would be part of NATO, then that would challenge kind of their sphere of influence. In 1954, the Soviet Union sends a document to the United Kingdom, the United States, and to France, expressing their interest in joining NATO. And they were immediately rejected, which isn't entirely surprising. If NATO would decide to accept the Soviet Union, then the Soviet Union would be able to have sort of access to these key conversations amongst leaders and be part of this international organization.
Yeah.
If and when NATO rejected Soviet intentions of joining the organization, then the Soviet Union could say, and they did say, that now they could prove that NATO was inherently anti-Soviet. A year later, in 1955, the Soviet Union creates the Warsaw Pact, which serves as sort of a counter-institution organization to NATO.
Very interesting, actually. The strategy that she explained here is very interesting. I think... Okay, so this is very interesting. I personally find it fascinating when we look at strategy in the past, whether it be modern history or whether it be medieval history or classical antiquity. Some of the best moves that strategists make is to create those scenarios in which they put the opponent, whether it be a nation, whether it be a kingdom, whether it be a state or a union, they put them in a position where they have to make a choice. And regardless what choice they make, it's a win-win for them. And in this case, I think this is one of those cases, which is why I find it fascinating. So if they say, yes, please join NATO, then now the Soviet Union has access to a lot of information resources and stuff that, you know, the West didn't want them to have access to. But if they say no, now they can use that as a way to say, oh, well, now we have proof that they have anti-Russian or anti-Soviet sentiment in these scenarios. So it's very interesting. I mean, I wonder who cooked up that idea, because it is a very, very good strategic move.
What was the KGB? So the KGB was the secret intelligence organization of the Soviet Union, founded in 1954 and existed until the collapse of the Soviet Union. But it existed under many different names and iterations. So the first name for the Soviet security forces was actually the Cheka, founded in 1917 by Felix Dzerzhinsky. Many people will probably also have heard of the NKVD, which refers to the name of Soviet security forces in the 1930s and 1940s. So it has existed since the Bolsheviks have taken over, but under different sort of names. And to this day, you can still find the KGB operating. It exists precisely in this name, the KGB, in Belarus. So they are a former Soviet republic that did not change the name of their security forces. Another important aspect to consider, similar to the employment issue, is that especially after the Second World War, the Soviet authorities make a very concerted effort to provide housing for people. And this comes through the period when Khrushchev is in power. So you have the mass sort of building of affordable housing essentially for people. And one could say perhaps the quality of these houses was not very good, but nevertheless, the effort to provide housing for ordinary citizens was something that really marked the 1950s and 60s in the Soviet Union. The next question is, were people hungry in the Soviet Union?
Same thing.
It goes back to sort of the poverty question. I think people associate hunger in the Soviet Union with the famine, which is very valid. There were several famines in the Soviet Union in the early 1930s, from 32 to 33. The most well-known famine was the Holodomor in Ukraine, in large part fueled by the state itself to kind of forcibly take grain away from the region. The other sort of less known famines that were also happening and were as equally devastating was the famine in present-day Kazakhstan and present-day Kyrgyzstan that cost the lives of nearly 2 million people. And that had to do a lot with the Soviet state kind of cracking down on the nomadic peoples that were living in this region. So there was famine and people certainly were hungry in the Soviet Union, but it mostly pertains to these sort of critical periods.
Yeah, and I appreciated at least she did underline, because I thought when she first said famine, considering what we have seen so far, the level of apologetics that we have seen so far, I thought she was going to say, well, you know, people, were starving to death, but it's because famine happened, natural disaster. So at least she did mention, I appreciate that. So I do want to be fair, give credit when credit is due. And she did say that oftentimes this famine was also due to the fact, to some choices specifically made by the state. But I would have also underlined that a lot of poverty and hunger that happened during this period was caused by the expansionistic nature and the warlike nature of this totalitarian regime. Because whenever you expand and start taking land and going into war, that's gonna create, as she did say, well, a lot of it happened under the war. And given they got attacked by the Germans, but it's not like they didn't expand themselves. I mean, what the heck were they doing in Poland? So, it is a horrible thing, but then again, goodness gracious, what a video.
The next question is, what did Soviet citizens think of the West? There was a sense of curiosity about the West. There was a sense of apprehension also, but mostly curiosity. People who were able to travel to the West did so, and these were usually children of Communist Party elites who had access to travel. Athletes, for example, who were competing in the Olympics. These would be musicians, perhaps, traveling to the West to do performances. And although these people were heavily monitored, they were able to see a bit of the West. And they were very curious. They were very surprised about the architecture, about the food, about the lives of people living, and the material culture, and the
Which is why the rest weren't allowed to.
access to goods. That was also something that people were very interested in. The next question is, did Soviet people have access to Western media? Yes, they did, and probably the most prominent example is Radio Free Europe, which broadcast frequencies to which people in the Soviet Union had access to. Of course, they would do this in secret, but it offered alternative news and an access to news that was not necessarily driven by the state. Oftentimes people talk about there being an iron curtain separating the East and West. But a more accurate term, which is one historians have put forth recently, is the idea that there was a nylon curtain, meaning that more goods, ideas kind of permeated between the West and the East, or the East and the West. They had access to media for sure. Was access expensive? Absolutely. So the ordinary person would not be able to afford necessarily sort of musical scores and pieces. And the final question is, what caused the collapse? Who were the leaders of the Soviet Union? Technically, the Soviet Union was supposed to function in a way in which the state and the party were separate, but that was not necessarily the case. For most of its existence, the leader of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union also functioned as the de facto leader of the Soviet Union.
Imagine that little jingle with a little cute music, but instead you're getting Benito Mussolini, the Austrian painter. Like, could you imagine that? Oh my gosh, the editor. All right, noble ones. I think I had enough of this. So thank you so much for watching. I hope that this was eye-opening for you. And no to all forms of totalitarian regimes. Thank you very much for watching. See you tomorrow. Metatron spread his wings.